Recording in progress. Great. So we want to have a general discussion about what the heck is going on in this play. Um, the play, in one sense, is not that complicated in the bare details. So once we've kind of established that, it will become pretty clear. Now, the specific nature of ultimately Iago's plot and his kind of conniving and contriving gets pretty sophisticated, but the general issue of what's going on is not too difficult to discern. So we want to establish the two basic things we want to do on Wednesday: establish the plot, establish the conflict, establish what happens, and then get into a little discussion about what you think the characters are like and what you think they're all about. And of course, that's going to develop over time as you get more familiar with them. That's just the way it is with people in real life. It's the same in a play, a drama, or a novel. So we want to get our initial impressions about what these characters are like, knowing that we're not going to have the full picture just yet. And the one amazing thing that Shakespeare does is to plumb the depths of human psychology and really paints a rich and broad and deep portrait of many of, not all the characters, but many of the characters. For example, Desdemona is not like, she's not on, you could say she's not on screen, she's not on stage that often. And her character in some ways seems rather simplistic, but it's also consistent with something about her personality itself. But the two main characters, for example, Othello and Iago, their psychology is plumbed quite extensively. And we see a big difference between, I mean, obviously we're going thousands of years into the future, almost 2,000 years from the written version of Homer, the canonical versions of the Iliad and the Odyssey, Greek epic poetry, to 17th century AD England, right? It's a very different world. We'll see some important similarities because Shakespeare was a great lover of classical literature, meaning Greek and Roman literature, and references to it and certain thematic frameworks are really built in to his plays that are in part derived from his appreciation of ancient literature. Not that that's the only perspective he brings to it, and that's one thing that complicates Shakespeare. Um, Particularly, you could say as a modern author, at least relative to Homer. But in the Odyssey, the characters in many ways are straightforward. I mean, even Odysseus, this man of twists and turns, as complex as he's presented, he's still pretty easily intelligible. And one of the beautiful things about Shakespeare is that he seems to present characters and situations that are very much like real life, in the sense that they're murky, in the sense that they're unclear, in the sense that it's not sure, you're not sure exactly who or what you're looking at. And he has this kind of, in that sense, of verisimilitude. And verisimilitude is like a fancy word for, it feels like reality, right? And this is particularly true of his characters. In ancient literature, the explicit goal of ancient literature was to please and instruct. And the instruction is typically rather clear. It becomes clear what actions are bad. It becomes clear what actions are good and which characters are bad and which characters are good. And the one way that's done, because it's not totally unclear in Shakespeare either, but the one way that's done is that the author themselves, through the narration or through what happens to the characters in terms of the plot, um, makes clear what actions are good and bad, and makes or bad, and makes clear which characters are good and bad. So when we finish the Odyssey, you very simply say, you know, the suitor's bad. They might not be diabolically evil, but they lack good character. That's quite obvious. They're not examples of virtue. Whereas other characters, we can go through a whole list of characters who are more virtuous and those who are less virtuous. Um, Shakespeare presents us the image with it seems to be without him making judgments about the characters. So, for example, on one hand, if you've started to wade into the play, there's something obviously diabolical about Iago, but there are also some other interesting features about Iago. And on one hand, Othello who these two main characters, Othello is really the victim of Iago's plot. On the other hand, Othello himself has some unsavory character traits that make him, to varying degrees, responsible for what's going on. So we're going to kind of get a feel for these characters and what they're like, because these two, one of the ironies of Othello is, in many ways, Iago is really the central character, not quite Othello. For one reason is he's kind of on stage almost more than Othello is, and second of all, he's actually a little more interesting, despite the fact that he's diabolical. Um, okay, so today I want to spend our time reading the text and having some fun with what happens in two sections. One, a look at Odysseus when he returns as the beggar and he interacts with the suitors, and particularly what it means, what we learn about it, and why this interaction becomes important for the conclusion of the text, which I also want to look at, and specifically the part of the conclusion that deals with the confrontation of the suitors in the the contest, and then the immediate aftermath of the contest. And so, because his initial contact with the suitors, you have to remember, in books 17 and 18, where Odysseus shows up as a beggar, this is his first actual contact with the suitors. We've had contact with them since the very beginning of the text in book 1. His family has had contact with them since the duration of their stay in Odysseus's household. And so we know what they're like, and I guess we're not surprised by the way they interact with Odysseus. But you have to remember that this is Odysseus's first encounter, and this first encounter with them starts to build up a kind of justification for what he does at the end. Connected with all this, I want to talk a little bit about one concept that becomes really crucial in the second half of the Odyssey. And it's on your study guide. And it's a concept, the Greek word is anagnorisis. Anagnorisis. And it's typically translated as recognition, right? And let's just be clear. What does it mean to recognize? What is recognition? Here, this is important. Here, we're not thinking about recognition in terms of a psychological trait where someone wants respect or honor or glory from other people, adulation. So we think of the word recognition, people want to be recognized for their worth. Here we're talking about something slightly different. Recognition in this context has to do with a coming to awareness of something, right? So recognition means recognizing a certain situation, for example, for what it is, having a kind of awakening, having the kind of scales fall from your eyes and your eyes open, like you could say Adam and Eve, they become aware of the condition they're actually in once they picked a fruit, which is to say they recognize a world in front of them that they were unable to recognize before. And so typically in Greek literature, the concept of recognition becomes really important in Greek tragedy, something we happen not to be looking at this semester. But in Greek tragedy, a character comes to awareness of somebody's identity, right? So recognition has not to do with recognizing any type of thing in general, but recognition has to do with recognizing a character for who they truly are. And the deep irony in tragedy is that it's the main character, the tragic figure, the protagonist, coming to recognize not who someone else is, but who they are, right? And I'll give you an example. In the play Oedipus Rex or Oedipus Tyrannos, somebody has killed the king of the kingdom that Oedipus now rules, right? And for various reasons, he essentially initiates a kind of like, it's almost like a criminal investigation in the kingdom to figure out who killed the former king. Well, question, who was it that killed the former king? Any thoughts about that? Anyone know the story of Oedipus? Any thoughts?
I mean, I don't know the story, but did he kill the king? Did he kill the king himself?
Yes. So Oedipus initiates an investigation to find the man who killed the king. At the end of the investigation, he discovers that it is himself, right? And he has this recognition that it is he who's done it. Oedipus knows that he killed a man on the road, but what he does not know is that the man he killed on the road was the king of Thebes, over which he now rules. And of course, there's another even darker recognition that he comes to awareness that his wife is also his mother, right? That's of course the kind of dark secret of Oedipus's situation. And so in this play, Odysseus really knows who he is. There's not a sense of him coming to awareness of his own identity in such a way. With Oedipus, there are parts of his identity that have been concealed, which is exactly why he has to discover them and why he's surprised to discover them, because he doesn't expect them to be the way they are. In the Odyssey, what we really have is the coming to awareness of Odysseus's identity on behalf of the other characters. So we see this if we go back to Alkinos's palace, where Odysseus shows up on the shore naked and dirty from being washed up from the storm. He's a stranger, and of course, to them, he is a stranger. But of course, we know him as the great heroic Odysseus who fought with the Achaeans at Troy. And so when Alkinos and his wife Arete meet Odysseus, he starts out as a stranger. And through through Xenia, through this process of guest host relation, through their conversation, through various things that happen in the palace, Alkinos and his wife come to a gradual awareness of who this person is. And of course, this knowledge changes their relationship to him, particularly when we discover that he's actually likely been concealing his identity from them because he's been on the run from Poseidon, and Poseidon ends up being the god whom the Phaeacians worship, right? Likewise, think about, can anyone think of other instances in this story where people are ignorant of Odysseus's identity and they become aware in a kind of consequential way of who he really is? Because remember, wherever he goes, he starts out as a stranger, right? And in many cases, people then become aware that he is Odysseus, the hero. Can anyone think of other examples where he starts out as a stranger and then people gradually come to an awareness of who he is and that has important consequences?
I think when he goes to Polyphemus's island and eventually um lets everyone know that it's him because his like desire to be known for what he did and like almost like basically hurt a son of a god, he wanted everyone to know. So that's some sort of
Yeah, I think that's absolutely a good example. And I mean, it's interesting that example has consequences for both characters. Odysseus ends up suffering as a result of kind of, you could say, outing himself as the perpetrator of the harm against Polyphemus. And in another sense, I think, partly here, there seems to be a logic in that conflict between he and Polyphemus, is that Odysseus might be the only mortal that knows how to outwit Polyphemus and overcome his raw strength, right? Because at the outset of that interaction, Polyphemus clearly thinks he has the upper hand simply because he's physically stronger and he's physically bigger. And he sees that as the primary kind of criterion for what constitutes power. And of course, Odysseus, you could say what he does to him is a reminder that physical strength is not only the thing that not only the dimension that constitutes power, And there's kind of an impression that only Odysseus could have done that to him. And of course, the moment he says his name is Odysseus to Polyphemus, Polyphemus says, "Oh my goodness, this is the coming to fruition of the curse that was foretold at one time by the gods, that I would be blinded by Odysseus." Um, so you can see how this logic has been set up. Can anyone think of another example where people come to awareness of Odysseus and who he is? There's definitely more examples. There's some bigger examples than others, but
I forgot the name of the people, but who were the people who took him in originally at the island and then gave him passage back home?
you mean the Phaeacians and King Alkinos?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure they're fully aware, but I mean, his identity basically gave him consequences.
Well, wait a second. Were they aware of his identity by the time he left? Can people, what do people think? Were they aware of his identity? On the island of Scheria, the land of the Phaeacians, whose king is Alkinos and whose queen is Arete, the daughter is Nausicaa. Are they aware that they're harboring Odysseus by the time he leaves? Nobody has the answer to that question? Brianna, what do you think? Do they know it's Odysseus when they send him back? When they send him back to Ithaca?
When he gets back to Ithaca, they don't know it's him.
No, I'm talking about the Phaeacians. You might not, that word may not come.
Oh, no, I thought they did know it was him. I thought it was part of like.
All right, so Brianna says that King Alkinos and his people knew. What do other people think?
I think they knew also. I think they knew that it was Odysseus.
Now, come on. How do they know it's Odysseus, folks? I mean, this should be. I know it's probably not fresh in your mind. I get that. So you may have read these passages a while ago, but how do we know that the people, King Alkinos and his people, the people in his palace, they know that's Odysseus? There's some dead giveaways.
Wasn't he crying when they were playing the Song of Troy? One of the
Well,
songs?
see, that's a giveaway, but I wouldn't call it a dead giveaway. They knew something was up with his identity there, but they didn't know for sure that was Odysseus. I mean, that's a good observation, absolutely. But what are some of the dead giveaways? Come on, folks. What is he? Because we want to get on to the business at hand today. What does Odysseus do while he's with King Alkinos and his wife in their palace? I mean, like the big, meaty, obvious thing that he does. Does he reveal his identity to them? Yes or no?
No.
Jose says no. Folks, how does he reveal his identity to the Phaeacians? Please, someone save us from this pit of despair. How does he reveal his identity to the Phaeacians and King Alkinos's palace and King Alkinos?
By showing the scar that he had.
Not to them, but that's another example in terms of someone becoming aware of his identity. Okay, thank you, Zane. He not only tells them his name, he fesses up, "It's me, I'm Odysseus." And of course, they've heard of him. Everybody's heard of him, right? What does he do beyond just telling them his name? What else does he tell them? Question, folks, because we want to move on. How do we, the reader, learn about? Well, that's a good one. He wants to get home to Ithaca. I agree. Zane, that's perfect. How do we, the reader, learn about the story from Troy?
He told them about the fight on Troy,
Pardon?
the fight,
The fight?
the war in Troy, the Troy war. He told them about it.
Okay. I mean, I don't think he spends much time talking about the war itself. What does he spend time talking about? That's actually given to the reader. How do we learn about this, the story of the island of Polyphemus? How do we learn about Circe? How do we learn about the bag of wind from King Aeolus? How do we learn about the cattle of the sun? How do we learn about their trip to Hades and the underworld to see Achilles and his mother and Tiresias? How do we learn about all that?
Odysseus talks about how Poseidon is punishing him for blinding his son.
This is true. Actually, I'm not sure he's I'm not sure he says that directly to King Alkinos. But he certainly talks about Polyphemus. How do we learn about all their trip from Troy up to the point that they get to the island where Alkinos lives with his wife? Who tells that story? Is it Homer?
Odysseus?
Yes. Starting in book 9. Starting in book 9. Odysseus, teller of tales, launches out on his story, and he's telling the whole story to King Alkinos and his wife and all the other people around in the palace who are listening. Right. So that's it. I mean, yes, he said, I mean, right prior to that, at the end of, I think it's book 8, at the end of book 8, he says, it's me, I'm Odysseus. And then in book 9, for many, about 3 books, right? 9 through 12, he spends his time telling them of his tales, right? Which are further, you could say something like a signature. You say, this is me, I'm the man who fought at Troy, and this is what happened to me on the way home. And then, I mean, if that's not enough, when Odysseus leaves the island of King Alkinos, they give him all these gifts. They give him bronze cauldrons and a whole array of things as kind of very formal guests gifts that he receives for having stayed at their island. And then not only that, if that wasn't enough, then the Phaeacians get punished by Poseidon for having been such good hosts to a man who's been on the run as a kind of convict, you could say, from Poseidon, right? So that kind of issue of his revelation of his identity is to King Alkinos is inscribed over and over again. Let's finish up with this one more example. So I think everybody's starting to see how this issue of recognition or the kind of revealing of one's identity, and that it's a process of development and revelation. You can start to see that this is a theme of the text, right? So the last example we'll look at before we look at the Suitors version of it is what is this scar all about? Anyone remember the story of the scar? And what's the situation where this scar gets revealed and what it means? And
The scar is on his foot, and that's his way to prove his identity.
yes, I think the scar is like on his leg somewhere, but foot good enough. And it's a kind of like an identifying mark, like you could think of like a tattoo, something like that. Does anyone remember who recognizes the scar as being what it is, and that, oh, the person with this scar is therefore Odysseus? Does anyone remember who recognizes it?
Isn't it his like maid?
Yes, it's an old maid. Xavion has the name Euryclea, right? This great name. And she is an old kind of maid servant who also took care of Odysseus when he was born. Right? She took care of not just Telemachus when he was born, but Odysseus, the old man. So you can imagine she's quite old, right? She's, near in the last stage of her life, right? And she's a loyal servant of the family and of Odysseus. And that's really important because there are a handful of servants. There's a goat herd and some other female servants who have what's the word? They've thrown in with the suitors, right? This is a political situation where all the people in this household, they stick their finger up in the air and they have to decide, who do I think's going to win? Because I'm just a servant. I'm a little person and I need to get by in the future. And if I think the suitors are going to win, maybe I'm going to throw in with them because that's like an act of self-preservation. So some of the people in the household have done that. Other people have stayed loyal to the family. One, because they think that's the right thing to do. And probably they think that's the right thing to do because they think highly of the family and that the family has been loyal to them and therefore they are loyal to the family. And Euryclea is one of these people who's really like a family member, even though she's not related by blood. And she's washing his feet and discovers the scar. Does anyone remember what Odysseus does when she discovers it? Is Odysseus thrilled by the fact that she's discovered it?
No, he isn't.
No, he's not thrilled. And it's not exactly her fault, but what's the problem here? Maybe we'll take a step back for a second here. So Odysseus arrives on the island, and remember, he doesn't recognize the island at first, and it seems to be symbolic that the life on the island has changed. And it kind of raises the specter, has it changed so much that it is no longer his home? Has it changed so much that it's no longer his home? But then the flip question is also relevant. Has Odysseus changed so much that Ithaca is no longer his home? If you imagine the reality of this book as opposed to kind of the there's a high degree of fantasy of certain sections of the book. And one of the fantastical elements of this book is that he could be gone for 20 years and then come home and just pick up right where he left off without a blip, right? That seems rather implausible, whether it's taking control of the kingship, whether it's returning to his wife's side and them just having a functioning marriage. These 20-year gap seems rather implausible, right? So, so this specter of change is raised, and whether these two things are congruous anymore, by which the two things by which I mean Odysseus, a changed man after war and a journey and time, and Ithaca, a changed world in Odysseus's absence and a very long absence at that. And the suitors are there, and you can fill in the gaps of the things that have actually changed there. So Odysseus is not recognized by everyone, but then we realize he does not want to be recognized by everyone. Why does he, when he's on the island of Ithaca, again, he desires to conceal his identity to most people? And the question is, what's the basic logic behind that?
Like he wants to think up his plan and reveal himself when he's ready and catch them off guard and be able to destroy the suitors.
Okay, good. So he first gets there. So he needs to strategize. He needs to buy time. And so you're saying something like concealing his identity gives him time, but to strategize, but it also allows him to catch the suitors by surprise. Something like that?
Yeah.
Okay. Let's ask this very quickly. It's pretty simple, but good. So that's great. Why does he need to catch the suitors by surprise? Why does he need to conceal his identity? What are some of the reasons behind that? Or maybe what other reasons are there? Because those are all very good reasons, but there's a bunch of really important reasons. And I mean, like, for example, why does he need to catch them by surprise? Why can't he just go in his front door, guns blazing, saying, "I am Odysseus"?
because he's outnumbered. Like even though he is so strong, like he's not like all powerful, really.
Yeah, so I mean, there are limits to the kind of superhero dynamic that's presented in this book of like what he's capable of physically. I suppose if it were really extreme, he could just walk in there and, you know, do away with everybody, you know, one or two, a few other people against tons and tons of suitors. I hate to say it, but somewhere in the book, it tells you the exact number of suitors that are there. And off the top of my head, I can't remember. Um, but it's dozens of suitors. I mean, his house is full. So he is outnumbered, right? So he doesn't have physical strength on his side. And you see now a little bit of, you see a strong parallel actually to what happens on the island of Polyphemus. He enters, just like on the island of Polyphemus, number one, physically outmatched. And here it's not, it's a matter of the numbers of a few of them, 108 suitors. Perfect. Thank you, Jose. And he's outmatched and he goes in as a nobody, right? He doesn't call himself nobody, but what does he pretend to be when he enters the household? What does he pretend to be?
Beggar.
Yeah, and what is a beggar in this world? A beggar is a nobody. And in fact, a beggar is even maybe worse than a servant or a slave. Everything in this world of the Odyssey has kind of institutional and hierarchical orders or institutional orders that are hierarchies. So when you get on these islands, you have this monarchical structure in many places, and everybody, remember the kind of great chain of being or the cosmic hierarchy, everything has its station, everything has its place. Remember the snake says, I have risen above my rank, or I've risen above my station by partaking of the fruit in Milton, right? So everybody has a place, an order of rank where they belong, right? And so even a slave or a servant has a place within a household, because while they are not free human beings and they have obligations to the head of the household also has an obligation to take care of them, right? I mean, if as disturbing as it is, a slave being a piece of property or a servant being close to property, if they are your property, you also have a responsibility to take care of your property. A beggar, on the other hand, is a person who's like, does not have a position within the social order of things. They do not have a position within the hierarchy of things. They're like an atom that's not connected to a molecule. They're like floating around. And so he literally comes as a beggar, as a kind of a nobody, right? So what's the function of all this? He has to do this. He has to conceal his identity strategically. Any other reason why he conceals his identity, apart from being outnumbered, apart from needing to bide time and develop a strategy and kind of he has to infiltrate his own household, right? If you think about it, undercover, right? We don't use that language for this text, but right, he's gone under deep cover here. Any other thoughts about why he needs to conceal his identity?
I think it's you don't want to get a kill.
Pardon?
He's scared. You don't want to get a kill.
Well, obviously, so this is a big thing. Odysseus
Yeah.
is not interested in the reckless act of courage that gets him killed. This man is a survivor. He is, you can't get home unless you're alive to get home, right? So he is obviously really concerned with self-preservation in a way that we wouldn't typically associate with a kind of heroic figure. If we think of Achilles again, he's willing to sacrifice his life for glory. Odysseus is not, right? And getting home is no doubt important, but it doesn't seem like the most glorious act or the most ennobling act. In many ways, it's an act of self-interest. And within the context of the story, it's presented as acceptable, right? There's nothing kind of degrading in any way about it or less than, right? Obviously, he wants to stay alive. Absolutely. He can't get his revenge. I mean, if part of what he wants to do is get juicy revenge, he's not going to do that if he's dead. Any other thoughts about, especially once he's inside his household, why he keeps his identity concealed, apart from the things we've mentioned?
Maybe because he just wants to see how everyone will act to the way that he, like, how he's begging, how his people would act to a beggar.
I definitely agree. And I think that's really crucial with the suitors and the way they treat someone who they think is just a beggar. We've seen Odysseus roll up on shores as a nobody, as a kind, I mean, in a sense, he's a beggar in the sense he comes to them as he says, I embrace them in an act of supplication. Act of supplication is basically like begging someone for help. It's a sign of a kind of not submission, but a subservient status, right? So definitely that's a key motive. Is it just the suitors though that he wants to see how they act?
He wants to find out from Penelope, but doesn't want her to know that it's him. Like what she ended up doing, maybe.
And who else? Is it confined to just Penelope?
And the son.
Yeah, and the son, and maybe everybody else in their household. I don't know. Best analogy I can think of is what's the show, Undercover Boss or something like that, where you go into as the boss, you go into your business, with a disguise on, and you see what people are really like. Because of course, if you go in as the boss, they're all going to kiss your butt and they're going to flatter you and they're going to be on their best behavior because they know you're coming. But when you show up unannounced and they don't know it's you, you get the real them. You get the real life of what's going on. And I think this is really crucial in terms of the justice that he's going to met out at the end. So, whether you want to call this revenge or whether you want to call it justice, we're in a world where there's no fundamental distinction between revenge on the one hand and justice on the other, because there's no police force, right? There's no judicial system. He's been wronged by the suitors and also some people in his household. And therefore in the way this world is portrayed in the book, he is therefore justified in seeking revenge. And then therefore if it's justified, it becomes a form of justice. But he gets to see all the people in his household, all his servants, and how they act without their awareness of his actual presence. And because he needs to suss out, you could say, who's naughty and nice, who's on our side and who's on the side of the suitors. And we discover, it's not talked about too much, but we discover that there are some servants who have sided with the suitors. And how they act is also going to determine what he does to them for their punishment. And you notice that there's an interesting order to which they are killed, for example, and a kind of process that unfolds when the ones he kills get killed. So let's come back to it and then we'll read. So Euryclea, she's washing this beggar. Remember, it's a beggar. His feet, and you see immediately that she's treating their guest, this just a beggar, with great respect and dignity, taking care of him. She shows her decency, her good character. And when she discovers it's Odysseus, she also displays her loyalty. And of course, Euryclea is portrayed as being overwhelmed with emotion when she recognizes him from the scar. And he says something like, "Oh, old woman, be quiet because you're going to foil my plan here. And I cannot be known." And he becomes very concerned that she won't be able to kind of keep her cool with the information she has, which starts to explain another reason why he's gone undercover. Anybody figure out the specific meaning of the scar? Does anyone remember the origin, where it came from, and kind of what it means?
He was hunting with his grandfather.
Yeah, and what happened to him?
He was attacked, I think, by a boar.
Yeah, so he was attacked by a boar, and I guess the horn of the boar I guess you would call it gored his leg, impaled his leg. And there's also a discussion of the origins of his name. Odysseus seems to be connected with odious, and kind of the one who is odious to the gods. And to be odious is to be rather unsavory, unpalatable, even kind of ugly. Any thoughts about, so this scar, it's a little bit like the fruit in Genesis. It's a physical thing that's on his body that identifies him, but it also has a kind of symbolic meaning. What's the significance of this scar? Any thoughts about that symbolically, what it might refer to? I mean, think about what a scar is. It's the kind of residual mark of some harm that's been done to your body that was painful, right? Likely painful. Any thoughts about its meaning? Because this is a pretty crucial moment in the story. I mean, there's a lot of time spent, this whole kind of aside where he gives the story of getting injured, which is a story that need not be told. I mean, the Homer could have just narrated this. Oh, and Eurycleus saw the scar, and knew it was Odysseus, and that could have been the end of this story. So Xavion says it has something to do with growth and maturity or maturation. You want to expand on that at all?
Coming to age type of scar.
I think it could. I think they're connected. What does a scar really represent? I mean, what produces a scar?
Laws.
Like an injury that happened that lasts forever.
Yeah, so we could think of the scar as literal and figurative, by which I mean like it's a physical bodily scar, or we could also think about the mental and psychological scars that he's suffered, right? And I mean, let's kind of say it. I mean, it seems to be that the scar has something to do, it's a kind of mark of his suffering. In the same way that Cain gets the mark as a fratricide, meaning he murdered, this mark that identifies him as the murderer of a brother, right? A murderer of his own flesh. Odysseus has this mark that seems to be a kind of symbol or manifestation of the various types he's suffering that he's experienced. And there are many Homeric epithets throughout the text. The long enduring Odysseus, the much suffering Odysseus. And of course, the first time we see him, as we said, he's crying, he's suffering. And of course, there are numerous moments where he breaks down and cries, we discover. And well, what's the connection between suffering and growth, suffering and maturation or character development?
That you have to suffer to grow.
Yeah, I mean, perfect. I mean, I think one claim is that, this scar is an emblem of life, right? I mean, for the ancient world, look at Job, right? Life is suffering, and then you die, right? Maybe it's not that quite that simple, but the ancient world really highlights the extent to which suffering is an intrinsic part of life that you can't magically take out with progress. You can't take it out with science. You can't make it go away. It's part of what our condition. It's part of our nature, and it's inescapable. It's an intractable reality. And of course, how do we really grow through life? We go through trial and error, right? We go through an experience, and mostly experience means suffering, and then modifying our thinking, modifying our actions in the future based on the suffering. If you think of the whole model of punishments and rewards, you learn by experience, and what's the expression? You learn the hard way, or you go through the school of hard knocks. Those seem to be the most enduring types of lessons, the ones that are painful. I mean, actually, Nietzsche talks about this. Because they're painful, guess what? you remember them really well. And when you remember something really well, you remember also that whatever you did that caused the pain, you don't want to repeat it. You don't want to do it again. So that seems to be lurking. So not only do we get a generic recognition that, oh, this is Odysseus with Eurycleia, we also get a more fine-grained vision of exactly the identity that we're recognizing here and its connection with this issue of suffering. Because of course, his whole story, as interesting as it's been, the text, Homer never fails to emphasize the suffering. Okay, good. So why don't we read and we'll just chat about the suitors' reactions here. So let me bring up this. And here, if you happen to have the book in front of you, it's on page 365 in book 17. And this is the first instance where Odysseus the beggar, undercover as the beggar, enters his own household after, essentially this 20-year hiatus or absence from home. You think about, one of the themes we talked about is yearning, right? He's looking, remember in book 5, he's looking across the ocean, the sea, and he's looking for a sight of home. He yearns to be home, and yearning is a kind of intense longing to achieve a goal. And the more you yearn, the more important the goal becomes. Because if you're yearning, it means you're committed to something that's not being satisfied immediately. So here's the irony. He finally gets home. He gets in his front door, home again, jiggity jig. And guess what? He has to present himself as another person, and he can't enjoy any of the benefits of his own identity, his own true identity in his own home until he gets rid of the suitors. Could we have somebody read for us here? Let me see if I can do this without causing too much. There we go. Who would like to read for us?
I'll read.
Afram, go for it.
The highlight, right?
Yes, starting with a highlighted portion.
Right behind him came Odysseus into his own house, looking for all the world like an old and broken beggar, hunched on a stick, his body wrapped in shameful rags.
Okay, so notice into his own house. I mean, there really is, in a sense, there's a question whether this really is his house anymore. And notice just how contrary this description of his physique is to what his actual physique is like. I mean, he's really, remember that Athena has kind of cast a kind of spell or magic to make him look even more decrepit than he really is, to be convincing to everyone. So we have to imagine this man who's like this old wizened man who's kind of broken down, his back is hunched over and looks kind of crippled, right? All right, you gonna keep going?
Just in a doorway, just at the ashwood threshold, there he settled down, leaning against the cypress post the master joiner, planned smooth and hung with a plumb line years ago. Telemachus mentioned the Swineherd over now, and choosing a whole loaf from a fine wicker tray, and as much meat as he outstretched hands could hold. He said, "Now take these to the stranger. Tell him to make the rounds and of the suitors. Beg from one and all. Bashfulness for a man in need is no great friend." And immune, I can't pronounce that. Emmaus did his bidding, went straight up to the guest.
So it's Eumaeus, and he's the swineherd, and is he the a loyal servant of Odysseus's family or a not so loyal servant? And someone other than Ephraim, because he's reading. Eumaeus is the swineherd. Does he have a good relationship with Odysseus and his family or a bad one?
I think good one.
Yes, he is the loyal swineherd.
Is loyal.
It isn't, yeah, that's the name of chapter 14, the loyal swineherd, because he's loyal.
Yes.
And Odysseus has this whole conversation with Eumaeus, pretending to be someone else, precisely to test Eumaeus and figure out where he stands. Does Telemachus know that this is his father at this stage?
No.
What do people think? So Hamadou says no.
We will clarify, he said later to Telemachus. And right now, I think no.
What do other people think? Important question. Why don't we keep going and we'll see if we can find out. You want to keep going, Ephraim?
Sure. Immunius did his bidding, went straight up to the guest and wished a greeting. Here, stranger, Prince Telemachus send you these, and tells you to make the rounds of the suitors, beg from one and all. Bashfulness for a beggar, he says, is no great friend.
Okay, so let's be really clear. This is actually pretty simple, but it's important to get these facts clear because they become significant. What is Telemachus doing for this beggar when the beggar shows up in the front door?
He told me to go out on a Suitor.
So he tells Eumaeus to do what for him? Telemachus orders his servant Eumaeus to do what for the beggar? It's not complicated, but let's get it straight. Yeah, so eventually he's going to make the rounds with the suitor. Absolutely, right? And so but let's just first recognize that Telemachus treats the beggar with respect. So when they encourage him to make rounds with the suitors, and he says bashfulness for a beggar is no great friend, or bashfulness is no great friend to the beggar. What is this about rounds with the suitors? What is that all about? What is the beggar going to do with the suitors? What kind of rounds is he going to make? It's not nursing rounds. It's not a round of golf. What is it? What is he going to do with the beggars? What is he going to do with the suitors? It turns out the suitors are beggars too, right? They're begging for the hand of Penelope, and they've been begging by taking all the food. Okay, Julio says it. Absolutely. He's going to beg the suitors for food and hospitality under the specter that he's impoverished and he's desperately hungry, right? So why is it, so bashfulness is to be shy, right? He says, when you're a beggar and you're starving, you can't be shy. And actually he's saying it's okay for a beggar not to be shy precisely because they're starving and need food, right? But what's the significance of Odysseus going around to the beggars? I mean, Odysseus is not a beggar. He has been provided with food and sustenance because he was staying out in the farm area prior to coming to the house. He's staying with Eumaeus in the kind of the farm, the pigsty area, which is somewhere, a few miles from the house itself. What's the function of him begging from the beggars, given that he doesn't actually need their food?
I think he's trying to test them.
Yeah, and what is it? Let's be more specific. What's the nature of this test? Absolutely, it's a test. I completely agree.
I wants to get an idea of their morale.
An idea of the morale. Anyone want to kind of pick up on what Akil is saying?
Maybe he kind of wants to see who they are, how they're gonna react to him.
Absolutely. What kind of people are these? Remember when Odysseus gets to Polyphemus's island, he says, could there really be someone here who wouldn't give food to people who have come from Troy? What kind of person would not provide sustenance to those who are hungry, who are heroes who just fought at Troy? What is the character of these people? And their character is going to be revealed by how they handle him coming around and begging, right? And again, this is another example of Xenia, right? It's a process of exchange. In this case, he's a nobody. He asks them for food, and hopefully they respond by giving him something and by treating him respectfully, even though he's just a beggar and they're nobility, right?
I have a question.
Yes.
At this point, do you think that he's still dead set on killing the suitors, or do you think through his tests is he trying to figure out whether they're worth killing or not?
Well, I think that's a really good question. Obviously, so you've just made a very key connection, which is that how they react to his begging. I mean, he's making a list here like Santa of who's naughty and nice. And once Santa makes his list, the list has meaning. Some people get nice toys and some people get coal in their stockings, right? So what he's really doing is testing them in terms of how he's going to punish or not punish them, what kind of revenge he's going to take out on them. So you're asking whether this process is really affecting his desire to get revenge. On one sense, superficially, I think yes, because he's making an assessment of these people, and actually how they react to him does have consequences when he kills them, and we'll see how. On the other hand, I kind of the impact is somewhat minimal because he knows he's going to get. I think reading into it, I think he's determined to get revenge, and it's just a little bit of the details. Now, are they going to be accommodating with Odysseus when he begs to them? So Hamadou makes a good point. I think the uncivilized suitors are going to get killed. And we could make another point. The most uncivilized, the most base, the least virtuous, they're going to get killed first.
Professor, I have a question.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask for a while. Does Odysseus know that the suitors before they killed the king, like the suitors killed the king before?
What do you mean?
Because the suitors killed some other king before, right? I think you mentioned that at the very beginning of the class when we started this book.
No, I don't think they've killed anybody. The issue is that Odysseus's father, I mean, this is unexplained in the story. Odysseus's father is still alive. And he's living out in the hinterlands with Eumaeus in, kind of like a little hut almost. He's not living in the palace. And it's unexplained exactly why Odysseus's father, given that he's still alive, in Odysseus's absence, can't just retake the throne and hold it until his son returns.
I think, Professor, he confused with like the other story, like I forgot the name of the guy.
Yes. He's confusing it with Agamemnon. Agamemnon comes home and gets killed.
Yeah.
And that, of course, is in that's in Mycenae, where that's his city state. So Odysseus has Ithaca and Agamemnon has Mycenae. So that's happening in a totally different place. That the key was that the stories were parallel, not that they were the same story, but that one creates expectations for the other based on what happens when he gets home in this situation where there are suitors. What's the irony? Well, let's be clear because we want to get moving on here. Are the suitors going to provide Are they going to be generous with Odysseus as a beggar?
No.
No, they won't.
No. What's the irony of that?
I think the irony of that is that, first of all, they're not even in their own palace, they're in somebody else's palace. And for them to, they're already beggar in the first place, in that
Yes.
place.
The suitors themselves, I mean, we might not use, it might be too strong a word, but essentially the suitors are beggars in that they're bringing suit, they're begging for the hand of Penelope, and they're also maybe not begging for, but they're asking for generosity in the household. They've been given all this food, they've been given all this drink, they've been given accommodations, and not only have they been given it, they've exploited it. And they haven't treated it with any respect, whether they haven't treated the physical place with respect, they haven't treated the people with respect, they haven't treated the ritual with respect, right? So whose food are they giving away or not giving away?
Odysseus.
Yeah, Odysseus, right? Yeah, I mean, this is ironic. Like, they won't even give away food that's not theirs, that they've been given themselves in a kind of like position to the one Odysseus is, and they can't recognize the similarity of their positions because Odysseus is just a beggar and they are noblemen. And so here you see an interesting play on the concept of noble and base, right? A noble person can be someone of high birth, but a noble person, that the word noble can also mean someone of good character. Someone who is base can mean someone of low birth, but it also can mean someone of low character. So the irony here is, if it's not too confusing, the base character, the beggar, is actually a nobleman at heart in terms of his true character, and the noblemen, meaning the suitors, are actually the characters who are base. They're really, they don't live up to their title, right? And let's see what they actually get. Let's see what Odysseus actually gets from the suitors. You want to keep going, Ephraim?
Sure. Powerful Zeus, the crafty king, responded, "Grant that your prince, the blessed among mankind, and all his heart's desire come to pass." Taking the food in both hands, setting it down, spread out on his filthy sack before his feet, the beggar fell to his meal, as the singer raised a song throughout the house. Once it souped and the string bard had closed, the suitors broke into uproar down along the hall.
Okay, just very quickly, the singer and the bard, what are we talking about here? He sat down to eat, and then the singer raised a song. And then the singer is referred to as a bard.
Like, they worked for the king when he was there.
Yes. And what is this singer? What kind of thing are they singing?
Not sure.
What did we see in Alkinos's palace? Anyone remember what a bard is? Okay, here it's singer, right? But this is a poet singing a story, right? Identical to what Homer is doing for us, right? Singing here is just the word for telling a story, because these stories, like the Homeric tales and tales like them, were told in a kind of musical rhythmic format, right? So what we're really talking about is a poet like Homer in the house, or a bard, a storyteller, except when they tell the story, they tell it in the form of a song, right? So in Alkinos's palace, they had Demodocus, who was the poet who was telling the tale of the Trojan War and the Trojan horse, for example, the one that made Odysseus cry. Oh, there we go. You want to keep going?
Sure. Take and give to the beggar. I don't grouge it. I would
Whoa.
even
Well,
urge you
let's
on.
start on the top of the left-hand page.
Oh, okay. Can you give me 1 second? Okay. And now Athena came to the side of Laertes, royal son, and urged him, "Go now, gather crust from all the suitors, test them, so we can tell the innocent from the guilty. But not even so would Athena save one man from death."
All right, so you notice the answer to the question is both and. On one hand, it's a test to measure degree of guilt. On the other hand, they're all going to get killed anyway. There's a kind of funny irony there.
Go on.
Yes, please.
Antinous, highborn as you are, you told the man, Emus, that that was a mean, low speech.
And just
You-
follow from there. Don't skip over to the next highlighted portion. Just keep.
Okay.
Yep.
Now who'd go out? Who on his own hook? Not I. An ask stranger in from nowhere, unless he had some skills to serve the house. A prophet, a healer who curses disease, a worker in wood, or even a God-inspired bard whose singing warms the heart. They are the ones asked around the world. A beggar who'd invited a beggar to bleed his household white.
Okay, what does that expression mean? Who'd invite a beggar to bleed his household white? What's that thing about the beggar bleeding the household white? That's a metaphor. Wait, I mean, what would you bleed? I mean, I guess you'd literally bleed an animal after you've killed it and drain it of its blood. Any thoughts about what that means?
Could it mean like white as in like pure and he's like lowly? So
Not
like,
quite.
or to like bleed him of all their stuff because he's gonna beg for it.
Yeah, exactly. Like eating them out of house and home. Right. And of course, the irony is it's not what Odysseus is going to do. It's exactly what the suitors have been doing, eating them out of house and home, bleeding them dry. Is an expression we're probably familiar with. You want to keep going, Ephraim?
Sure. You all of the suitors are always roughest on the servants of our king, on me most of all. Not all I care, no so long, and his queen, I can't see what's below.
It's there. I think maybe
Okay,
adjust
I see it now.
screen.
Not that I care, no so long as his queen, his wise queen, is still alive in the palace. Prince Telemachus too. Stop, emissaries. Poised Telemachus broke in quickly now. Don't waste so much breath on Antinous here. It's just his habit to bait a man with abuse and spur the rest as well. He wheeled on the suitor, letting loose. How kind you are to me, Antinous. Kind as a father to his son, encouraging me to send his stranger packing from my house with a harsh command. I would never do it. God forbid. Take and give it to the beggar. I don't grouge it. I would even urge you on. No scruples now. Never fear your gift will upset my mother or any servant in the King Odysseus' royal house. But not so much qualm could enter that head of yours, bent on feeding your own face, not feeding strangers.
So this is Telemachus speaking, encouraging Antinous, who's effectively kind of the head of the suitors. He's like the main representative who does most of their talking, encouraging him to give to the beggar, despite the fact that Antinous thinks this is ridiculous, right? Because he's a beggar, doesn't deserve anything. You want to keep going?
Sure. Antinous countered the young prince in kind. so high and mighty. Telemachus, such unbridled rage. If all the suitors gave him the sort of gift I'll give, the house would be rid of him for 3 whole months. With that from under his table, besides the stool that propped his smooth feet, and as he revealed on, just lifting into his view.
He seized the stool. He grabbed it, right? Stool, thing he's sitting on, right? Like, like a four-legged little stool that we have today.
But as for the rest, all gave to the beggar, filled his sack with handouts, bread and meat. And Odysseus seemed at the point of getting back to his Dursil, done with testing suitors, home free himself, when he stopped beside Antinous, begging face to face, "Give me a morsel."
All right. So now he's begging to Antinous. And, we don't see it depicted him begging with all the other suitors, because Antinous is really kind of he's like the microcosm of them all together. And we just need this one example. Anyone remember what Antinous is going to give Odysseus for all his begging? Okay. We'll have to find out. Why don't you keep going a little bit more here?
Sure. Antinous, begging face to face, "Give me a morsel, friend. You're hardly the worst. A king here, it seems.
Yep.
The noblest one, in fact. You look like a king to me. So you should give a bigger crust than the rest, and I will sing your praises all across the earth."
Okay. Who is the first suitor to die?
Antinous. Or
Yes. Now he's looking at Antinous face to face. And does he already know that he's ready to kill Antinous when the moment presents itself? Does he already know that Antinous is going to be the first one? I think he already has a sense here of who the worst suitor is. I mean, Antinous is very demonstrative. He's the one who stands out. So he'd be the first guy he'd become aware of in the room, right? So when he says this to Antinous, "Oh, you're a king, you should give me the biggest crust," I think he already knows. He says he's really saying, "My friend, you're going to be the first to die." But of course he can't say something like that.
Yeah, because as he's saying that, he's like, he kind of sees him as the leader.
Yeah, and absolutely. All right, so then, what he does here in this speech on the left is he says, "You've got to give a morsel to me." And then he talks about all his trials and travails that he's been through to explain why he's a beggar. And of course, this story is completely made up, right? Odysseus just contrives. Again, this is Odysseus, teller of tales. And then, so let's just pick up down here. At the end of Odysseus's speech, which is basically like a really long plea, say, "Please give me the big crust of bread," and so on. You want to pick up "Good God Almighty"?
"Good God Almighty." Antinous cut the beggar short. "What spirit brought this past plead our feast? Back off, into the open, clear of my table, or you'll soon land in an Egypt, Cyprus, to break your heart. What a brazen, shameless beggar, scrounging food from each man in turn, and look at their handouts. Reckless, never a qualm, no holding back, not when making free with the next man's good. Each one's got plenty here."
Okay, so we could just a couple minutes. Just notice the tremendous lack of self-awareness Antinous has when he says this. What he says here could equally be said about him, but because he sees himself as a special noble and he's just talking to this, dirty beggar, this nobody, he just is totally blind to the fact that what he's just said here about being a shameless beggar, scrounging fruit, looking for handouts, never a qualm, not holding back, making free with another person's goods. That means just taking them at your pleasure, right? That's all true of Antinous.
Pity, the wry Odysseus countered, drying away. No sense in your head to match your handsome looks. You'd gouge your servant a pinch of salt from your own larder. You who lounged at the next man's board but lacked the heart to tear a crust of bread and hand it to me. Though there's good
Yeah.
plenty here.
Great. So instead of getting the crust, he gets more insults from Antinous. And then Odysseus eggs him on even more and provokes him, right? And he said, one thing he says, no sense in your head to match your handsome looks. There's a gap here between you could say the outer and inner man. Outwardly, he's a noble person. Outwardly, he's handsome, but what's on the inside is decrepit. And his name, Antinous, anti means like the opposite of, just like, I mean, it's our prefix anti is a Greek prefix. And in Greek, nous means mind. So his name, the irony of his name is that it literally means a person without mind. Or in this sense, it's translated as lacking sense. And obviously, I mean, Antinous is not stupid in one sense. He's a fairly clever guy, but he lacks prudence. He lacks good judgment. He lacks wisdom, things that Odysseus has learned as a result of his suffering. Odysseus is still a hero, but in the course of his suffering and his journey, he was brought down several pegs, and the suitors have never kind of you think about Job, like Job never had reason to fear God. The suitors have had an easy life. They've never experienced suffering. They don't know how to kind of pick themselves up. So they have a particular arrogance as a result of that. Let's see what Odysseus gets for his troubles.
Boiling over, Antinous gave him a sketching look and let fly. Now you won't get out of the hall unscared. I swear, not after such a filthy string of insult. With that, he seized the stool and hurled it. Square in the back, it struck Odysseus, just under the right shoulder, but he stood up against it, steady as a rock. Unstaggered by Antinous' blow, just shook his head, silent, his mind churning with thoughts of bloody work. But he went to the doorsill, crouched, and setting down his sack about to burst. He faced the suitors, saying, "Hear me out, you lords who court the noble queen. I must say what the heart inside me urges. There's nothing to groan about, no hurt when a man takes a blow as he fights to save his own possessions, cattle or shining flocks. But Antinous..."
Okay, that's great, because I want to look at one other passage just to go a couple minutes here. So that's great. What does he get instead of a big crust of bread? He gets what? What does Antinous do after Odysseus kind of trash talks him, saying no sense in his head? Think about it, this is a beggar speaking to a nobleman. No sense.
They're kind of like provoking him.
Well, absolutely. Odysseus is provoking them. And how does Antinous respond? He loses his cool and does what?
He throws the stool at him and it hits him in the back.
Yeah, hits him in the back. And like it's also like he gets hit in the back by a stool, and he's supposed to be a decrepit beggar who's kind of hunched over and feeble, and yet he's steady as a rock, like he's completely unfazed. So the way this beggar is interacting with them, the point I want to make here, the thesis, and the way he takes this blow, that's a serious blow, they should start recognizing that this is no ordinary beggar. And then, of course, he goes on to fight Eros, the other beggar, and he smashes the bejesus out of Eros. And they're a bit stunned, but they still have no clue it's Odysseus. So, then we get to this moment where Odysseus strings the bow. And I'm just going to read it in the interest of time as quickly as I can. So I think we said last class the person who strings the bow has to be Odysseus, because only Odysseus can string this bow, because it's his bow and it's a special one that only, and this is exactly why Penelope devised this test or this challenge, because she assumed that the only person who can string it is Odysseus. And says now he held up the bow in his own hands, turning it over tip to tip, testing it the way, this way, that way, fearing worms had bored through the weapon's horn with a master gone abroad. A suitor would look, would glance at his neighbor, jeering, taunting. Look at our connoisseur of bows. All right, so think about it. Odysseus has just strung the bow, and the suitors are making fun of him. Well, he's in the process of stringing the bow, but he picks up the bow with a certain acumen. He's described as a virtuoso. He has a kind of expert touch with this thing, and they're still sitting there making fun of him for the way he's handling it, despite the fact that he's showing great expertise. Sly old fox, maybe he's got a bow like it stored in his house. And of course, a beggar doesn't have a house. That is, he's bent on making one. Look how he twists it and turns it in his hands. The clever tramp means trouble. I wish him luck. Sure, cocksure lord chimed in, as good as his luck in bending back that weapon. So they mocked Odysseus. They mocked, but Odysseus, mastermind in action, once he had handled the great bow and scanned every inch, then like an expert singer skilled at lyre and song, that's a stringed instrument, who strains a string to a new peg with ease, makes the pliant sheep gut fast, making the pliant sheep gut fast at either end. So with his virtuoso ease, when you do something with virtuosity, you do something that's very hard and you make it look easy. With virtuoso ease, Odysseus strung his mighty bow. Quickly, his right hand plucked the string to test its pitch like a musician. And under his touch, it sang out clear and sharp as a swallow's cry. It's great. Horror swept through the suitors, faces blanching white, and Zeus cracked the sky with a bolt, his blazing sound. So, you know, in those the horror movie where the lightning bolt strikes, and you know that's like an ominous sign. That's exactly what you get here with this lightning strike. And they blanch white with terror. They're afraid. Let's just be clear. Why are they afraid? Why are they afraid here?
They recognized him.
Yeah, they think it might be Odysseus.
Do they
This
know
is something
Odysseus?
unusual for them. This is something unusual for them.
And the man is strong.
All right, here's the catch, folks. They don't recognize it's Odysseus yet, but they do see a man who's exceeded their expectations, who now, he doesn't just have a strung bow to win the contest, he now has a weapon in his hands that can kill them, right? And despite the fact that their faces have blanched, they still don't get it. It's quite amazing. They go through this, you know, like the 7 stages of grief. It like takes time to come to full awareness. They've made some connections in their brain, but they refuse to acknowledge that the man before them is Odysseus. So I'll go for it. Any thoughts about why that might be? Any thoughts about why they just cannot come to the realization that this is Odysseus?
The thing
Because
about
they're
them,
expecting. Sorry, go ahead.
Because this is really the big question. Duh, we all know this is Odysseus. We should all recognize this. The suitors do not recognize it's him.
Because the suitors, since the beginning, they were trying to say that he's dead. He'll never come back. They're just ignorant.
So wishful thinking, right? So this has to do with human psychology. It no longer has to do with the facts, because quite honestly, the facts have been presented them. They should know better, but they don't. So number one, they don't want it to be him. If it is him, what do they know? If it is him, yes, they're in denial. And then the last little bit is, why are they in such denial? And it's pretty simple when you realize.
If it's him, then they'll be dead. Like he'll kill them.
Absolutely.
they will be dead.
If it's him, they are dead because they know what they've done. They just never thought in God's green earth that he'd ever make it back, right? That's the cows come home type scenario, right? So just 2 seconds here and we're done. Now stripping back his rags, Odysseus, master of craft and battle, vaulted into the great threshold, gripping the bow and quiver bristling arrows, and poured his flashing shafts before him, loose at his feet. So he takes the arrows out on the ground, like the contest is over. He doesn't, what's coming next, but the suitors are still oblivious. Looses his feet and thunders out at the suitors. Look, your crucial test is finished now at last, but another target's left. That no one's hit before. We'll see if I can hit it. Apollo, give me glory. With that, he trained a stabbing arrow on Antinous. So you saw this is coming. It was going to be him all along. Just lifting a gorgeous golden loving cup in his hands, just tilting the two-handled goblet back to his lips, about to drain the wine and slaughter the last thing on the suitor's mind. Who could dream that one foe in the crowd of feasters, however great his power, would bring down death on himself and black doom? But Odysseus aimed and shot Antinous square in the throat, and the point went stabbing clear through the soft neck and out the other side. He pitched, the cup dropped from his grasp as the shaft sank home, and the man's lifeblood came spurting out in his nostrils, thick red jets. A sudden thrust of his foot, he kicked away the table. Food showered across the floor, the bread and meat soaked in a swirl of bloody filth. It's like a bunch of dominoes falling in a row. So he's literally taking a sip of wine by the table as Odysseus trains his arrow on him, shoots him in his neck. The blood squirts out everywhere. It's like red wine, actually. And then he slips and falls. He knocks over the table and the food goes everywhere. Antinous is completely oblivious that this is Odysseus, and he dies, it seemingly with an unclear understanding of what's going on. Any thoughts about why he's depicted in the middle of drinking wine by the table with all the food on it as he is getting killed? I think the fact that he's drinking the wine at that moment lets you know that he remains oblivious. I mean, it's not like he doesn't see what's going on. He sees it, but it just does not compute for him. He's in denial, deep, deep, deep denial. We could be living in this world ourselves with what's going on in our country and the world, what's really going on. That's a discussion for another time. Why is he drinking wine when he gets shot? What have they been doing the whole time they're there?
Eating and
Eating, squander everything.
Yeah. And I mean, Odysseus, I mean, what do they want from their lives? We talked about someone being driven by their bodily appetites. Odysseus, we don't really see, apart from self-preservation and survival, we don't see Odysseus as a character dwelling on the pleasures of food and drink as the main goal in life. I mean, he has certain principles connected with his family, connected with being with a good leader, a good ruler, a good father, a good husband, at the very least implied. And these men are concerned with just enjoying themselves. And obviously everything Odysseus has gone through has not been an enjoyment. Much of it is suffering, right? So they're decadent. And I mean, in the moment that they should come to awareness, recognition, this thing anagnorisis, they should come to recognition of who this man is. He remains completely oblivious. Now, eventually the other suitors who are still alive, they realize who he is, but Antinous, it still hasn't hit him. And of course, the level of denial here is just kind of like off the charts, because the reader, I think as a reader, it's kind of hard for you to imagine that the character doesn't realize who he's dealing with, but the way it's written, it becomes very clear that he doesn't, right? So thanks for hanging in there. Thoughts, question, comments before we go here? Any observations or reactions?
I have like a reaction or like a question.
Yeah.
So is it like that since this was so long ago, is it their education, like they just don't have the common sense to understand that this is him?
Since it was so long ago, these are human beings. These are the most educated people. I mean, common sense has nothing. We know that common sense has nothing to do with education. Common sense has to do with prudence and learning from experience. I mean, I think, remember, sing for our time too. The Antinous still exists today. Oh, come on. Antinous still exists today in any variety of forms. You know, just think about all those Hollywood celebrities and all those powerful people who think they're completely untouchable and that they're never going to get their comeuppance. And that therefore they can be oblivious to it because they know they got it made and the system works for them and they're never going to get punished. Shoshana, yeah, you're welcome. Thank you. So if you need to go, feel free to go. It's recorded. So any questions? No, absolutely. I mean, these are real people. This has nothing to do with ancient times and what people were like then. I mean, absolutely, people are still like this today. I mean, it takes you have to be kind of exceptional to be like Antinous, but any other thoughts?
Yeah, it makes sense.
Comments? Pardon?
It makes sense.
Okay. I mean, these guys think they're, they think they're hot shit, right? They think they're the bee's knees, right? And it's partly because they think so much of themselves, yet they don't actually have the wherewithal to deal with Odysseus, which is why they're in denial. If they had the skills to deal with Odysseus, they might try to confront him. But since they know they can't, because they've never been tested this way, and Odysseus has spent 20 years being tested, right? I think they prefer to stay in a state of denial about it, because that's the best way to cope with it for them. Any other thoughts before we go here? All right, thank you, Karen. All right, so with that, thank you all for a lovely class, and we'll pick up with Othello on Wednesday.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you all. Have a great night.
Professor, I had a question for you, but I was waiting until after class.
Yeah, so let me, what's happening? Let me turn off the, well, one second here.
Okay.
I just undid this. So let me stop.